All right, welcome everyone. I assume you can hear my voice, and there are handouts for tonight's class that are in the handout section and the GoToWebinar control panel that's over on the right. If you have difficulty, which you shouldn't, but if you do, I'm going to paste in a direct link that's actually in the chat, should be. And I assume you all can hear me, correct? Thank you. All right, let's start with tonight is sort of a group of different topics, like many of our classes are, focused on what the Department of Real Estate expects you to know for the licensing exam. We're going to be finishing the section on real estate law, which we talked a little bit about last week. And then we're going to go into professional associations and into economics, which isn't in the title, but anyhow, we're going to cover that as well. The Business and Professions Code is the set of codes that regulate people that need licenses from the state of California in order to do whatever they do in order to be in their business or career. And there are lots of sections of it that deal with real estate. And tonight we're going to be talking about a couple of weird little sections that occasionally makes its way onto the state licensing exam. And the first one is Article 7. And Article 7 is a part of the real estate law that is designed to protect borrowers when they're borrowing money and using a real estate agent. This is a really, really old law. I mean, a really old law. I've been teaching real estate licensing classes like this for a really long time. And when I started, this had been around for a really long time. And you're going to see when we get to some of the numbers that it's a really old law. And the law deals, in some ways, this section of Article 7, its name used to be the small loan law, the small loan law. And it deals with hard money loans, which is where the borrower receives cash using a note secured by a trustee. That's a type of mortgage. Notice it applies to first trust deeds less than $30,000. Now, how many loans do you think there are on real estate that are under $30,000? Not very many, especially firsts. Junior loans, which would be a second or a third, under $20,000. There was a time, a really long time ago in California, where you could buy houses for under $40,000, under $50,000. That was a long time ago, but the law hasn't changed. It's still in the Business and Professions Code, and the Department of Real Estate occasionally asks questions about it. Now, essentially, what this law is about is that if you, as a real estate licensee, were to negotiate a tiny loan, you shouldn't be all that proud of yourself and gouge the borrower with commissions and costs. So it does two things. One is it limits commissions. And the example is if it's a first trust deed and it's less than 3 years, you can charge 5%, which, by the way, is a lot. Right, a lot. A typical loan that you would get to buy a house might be 1 and 1 1/4, 1.5. 10%. If the loan is more than 3 years, this is a cash out loan. And if it's a second, it's 5 if it's less than 2, 10 if it's more than 2 but less than 3, and 15% if it's 3 or more. Chances are good you're not going to be asked about these numbers. There was a time when the Department of Real Estate had math questions involving these numbers, right? But we haven't heard about them using that on the state exam, and the Department of Real Estate has pretty much given up all math questions, right? Virtually no math questions are ever asked on the state exam. So the limit, look at this, 15% on the second trust deed of 3 years or more. That's a big commission. So in addition to limiting the commissions, but not very limiting, but limiting the commission, they also limit the costs. And essentially what this formula says is that in addition to all those high commissions, they can charge 5% of the loan amount as a cost, but no more than $700, but no less than $390. And whether you remember this or not, I wouldn't spend a lot of time. Chances are really good the Department of Real Estate is not going to ask you to do the arithmetic. The next section, however, is far more important for the state exam. And that's because the California Department of Real Estate has created their very own mortgage loan disclosure statement, which details all the costs and expenses. And this must be given to the borrower. They have to prepare it, the broker, and give it to the borrower. And notice it says here for any loan negotiated by a broker, regardless of the amount. So this is not part of the small loan law. If you're a mortgage broker, and the reason the Department of Real Estate asks these questions is because one of the things that you can do with a real estate license is you can do loans. And if you're doing loans in California, in addition to the Federal Truth in Lending and the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act and all of those other disclosures, you have to, as a loan originator, as a loan agent, also give the borrower a copy of this form. Any loan negotiated by a broker. And like all things in real estate, agents and brokers have to keep a copy for at least 3 years. And it's given to the borrower, and you have to give a copy to the borrower when they sign it. That's pretty much what it says. This is designed to benefit borrowers, and you need to know for the state exam that the Department of Real Estate is likely to refer to borrowers as trustors, and that's because it's more confusing, and they're trying to catch you, and they want you to make a mistake. But a trustor is a borrower. By the way, once you get your real estate license and you're doing loans or working with loan agents, no one's ever going to say trustor again. But anyhow, it states the liens against the property. It includes the broker's commission. It's a form approved by the real estate commissioner. If you Google searched mortgage loan disclosure statement, you would find copies. There's undoubtedly copies in your California Real Estate Principles book. It's a DRE form. Interest cannot be charged until the funds have been deposited in escrow. That would seem like a reasonable rule. So if it's Friday and the borrower has signed the loan documents, but because of the timing, the lender isn't actually going to fund the loan until Monday, the lender isn't allowed to charge you interest over the weekend because they didn't actually give you the money yet, which would seem, reasonable. If a license, there's many real estate companies have in-house lenders as opposed to an outhouse, lender. No, I guess that's not related. And there's a form called an affiliated business relationship disclosure. So some real estate companies have lenders in their office. And although it's like a joint venture is usually how they work it, where the company that owns the broker also owns the lender. And so pressure is put on the agents to use the in-house lender. And sometimes they actually compensate agents if they get people to use the in-house lender. Now, our company, eXp Realty, doesn't do that, but there are some companies that do that. And if you're doing that, there's a form called an affiliated business relationship disclosure, which is included in all the escrow papers and signed by everybody. And if the agent, the buyer's agent, is actually getting a kickback, a referral fee by directing the buyer in order to get to use the in-house lender, that fee would have to be disclosed. An exclusive loan listing, this is in the Business and Professions Code, but this is not a real thing, right? Not a real thing. And what an exclusive loan listing would be where you signed a document that said that only this mortgage broker is allowed to negotiate a loan for you. You don't have the right to check out Wells Fargo. You don't have a right to go to Golden One Credit Union. You got to use that particular mortgage broker, and that's limited to 45 days. Do people actually do that? I've never heard of anyone doing that. But anyhow, it's in the Business and Professions Code and therefore makes its way on the state exam. If the failure to disclose, if a loan cannot be completed because the borrower failed to disclose all existing liens, borrower is liable for costs and expenses and half of the commission. Now, you might be thinking that that rule was put into the code to protect the poor mortgage brokers and allowing them to get some money if the borrower doesn't disclose, and as a result, the loan cannot be made. But that's not exactly why it's there. Because what was happening prior to this is that the way the loan agents, the mortgage companies would write it up, is it said, if you fail to disclose all of your liens and things like that, and we can't get you the loan, they made the borrower to be liable not only for costs and expenses, but the entire commission, the whole thing. And so the law said that's too much, so they only get half. A balloon payment. This is a relatively common question on the state exam. This is the code definition of what constitutes a balloon payment. It is any payment that is at least twice the amount of the smallest payment. It is not allowed on hard money loans of 6 years or less, owner-occupied dwellings, and not allowed on hard money loans of 3 years or less if it is, well, not residential owner-occupied. The problem with a balloon payment is people have to save money for it. So people are making installment payments and they're able to cover those payments. And then if they kept going on, but after 3 years or 5 years, all of a sudden there's a balloon. Sometimes this is called a 30 due in 5 or 30 due in 3 or 30 due in 7. And what those kind of loans are is the loan looks like you're going to be making payments for 30 years, but then in 7 years or 5 years or whatever, you have to pay off the remainder. And if people aren't given enough time to save the money, then they're not going to be able to pay off the balloon. So if this is an owner-occupied residential property, 1 to 4 units, there's no balloon payment allowed during the first 6 years. Now, if it's commercial property, there's no balloon payment allowed during the first 3 years. But on year 4 or 5 or 6, they could do it. Another relatively obscure part of the Business and Professions Code that the Department of Real Estate likes to ask questions about is what's called Article 5. Remember, Article 7 protected borrowers that were getting loans through real estate brokers. Article 6 was repealed, so I'm not going to explain it. Article 5 was designed to protect lenders, private lenders that are dealing with real estate brokers. Now, notice it says to begin with, this rule does not apply to loans or notes in connection with the sale or exchange of property handled by the licensee. So if I'm a real estate agent and I'm selling a property, we're not talking about the loans that are involved in that. The next paragraph is a definition that is often on the state exam. And what it is essentially saying is that if a person is selling real estate paper, not real estate, but paper, they're regulated under this law. And when we say somebody is selling real estate paper, what we mean is they're not selling the house, but they're selling the loan on the house. And anyone who buys or sells, buying for the purpose of resell or actually sells 8 or more real estate paper in 1 calendar year is in the business of selling real estate paper, and they either have to use a real estate broker or be a real estate broker. Now, a person can sell real property that they own without having a real estate license. It's called a for sale by owner. Could a for sale by owner sell 2 houses that they own without using a real estate agent in 1 year? Sure. How about 5, right? If you owned a whole bunch of properties, could you sell 5 houses that you own by yourself without using a real estate agent? Why not? How about 10? Sure, any number, any number. But when it comes to buying and selling real estate paper, that's considered to be more of a hazardous substance. Because if you're selling real property, then people will go look at the property. They can have it appraised. They can, kick the tires, as it were, and check out the house and all that sort of stuff. But if somebody, most of the time when people are buying real estate paper, they never go look at the house. They don't go get an appraisal. They're just investors and they're buying the stuff, Sometimes like crypto, right? You don't really know, right? You don't really know. So because it's more dangerous than the buying and selling in real estate, you're required to either have a real estate license or use somebody that does if you're doing this 8 or more times in any year. If these were houses, you could sell as many as you wanted, but because it's not a house and real estate paper, you have to be in the business. You have to have a broker's license or use a broker. A licensee who services a promissory note. Servicing, when you see that phrase, really means bill collecting. They need to have written authorization to do so. They can't keep the money without written authorization from the lender. Now, this law only really applies to private lenders. It does not apply to banks and things like that. A licensee who negotiates a loan shall have it recorded either before the money is given out or within 10 days. If they assign the loan, they should record the assignment. This does not apply to banks. And the reason is because, well, banks know what they're doing. Essentially what the law is saying, if you can talk Bank of America into giving you authority to collect payments on their loans for them without it being in writing, or letting you keep the money as long as you want to before you turn it over to them, good for you. If you can convince Bank of America to do that, good for you. But you understand, Bank of America is not going to do that, right? Because they know what they're doing. But is it possible that there are private investors, amateurs, doctors, lawyers, engineers sometimes, who have some money pooled together and they meet a real estate broker? The real estate broker said, hey, not only will I find you, loans where your money is going to be lent, I'll collect the payments, I'll take care of everything. You don't have to worry about it. Now, that private investor may not know what they're doing, may not understand what recording laws are and when you record and how you record and what's the purpose of. They may not understand all that. So if the real estate broker is working with private lenders, amateurs, they can't collect the payments or keep the money more than 25 days without written authorization. They have to record the documents within 10 days or let them know you should record these documents. A promissory note secured collaterally by a lien on property is a loan being secured by another loan. This sometimes seems weird, but let's say I've lent a whole bunch of people money. So I have all these accounts receivable, but I need some cash right now. So I go to a lender and the lender says, well, what do you got for security? Where's your collateral? And I show them all of these loans that I've made where people owe me money. And so the lender lends me money with those loans being the security for it. That's what that previous statement meant. If a broker escrows a sales transaction, the seller carries back a deed of trust, the broker must record the trust deed within 1 week. And then this next section about a promotional note, I need to delete that because the Business and Professions Code has been recently modified and they no longer have promotional notes. So you could cross it out. You're not going to be asked that anymore. Promotional notes were part of Article 6, and Article 6 was repealed. If a broker is servicing a promissory note advances their own funds, that seems like they must be nice if they're willing to do that. In order to protect the security of the loan, the broker must, within 10 days, give written notice. What's going on here is, so the loan agent, the mortgage broker says, hey, we got a lot, interest rates are high, you can make a lot of money lending money on seconds and hard money loans to people on real estate. It's really safe because it's on real estate, so you're never going to lose anything, and I can handle it all for you. I'll find the borrowers, I'm going to negotiate the loans, I'll collect the payments for you, I'll do all of that kind of stuff. But let's say one of those loans, the person isn't paying. Well, I don't, if I'm the mortgage broker, want the people that are lending the money to know this. So I start advancing some of my own money just to keep the pyramid going. And I can't do that. Within 10 days, if I'm actually advancing my own money in order to cover some of this, servicing the debt, I have to give notice to the lender that I'm doing that, because something is probably wrong. That's it for the weird little sections on the remainder of real estate law. Fair housing. Now, in terms of this, there are state laws, and then there are federal laws, and there are more that have been adopted somewhat recently. But we're going to go through what you need to know for the state exam. And you need to know to begin with that the entity in the state of California that enforces most of these laws is called the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. And it applies to landlords, real estate agents, home sellers, builders, mortgage lenders, and others like property managers. And it prohibits discrimination in all aspects of the housing business, including renting, leasing, mortgages, everything. It's included. Now, the first law is called the Unruh Civil Rights Act. Many of our laws are named after politicians. There was a politician by the name of Jesse Unruh, and this was his law. And notice it prohibits discrimination by businesses. Real estate brokerages are businesses, property managers are businesses, mortgage companies are businesses, and therefore, as such, come under the Unruh Civil Rights Law. And notice the list. It says discrimination based upon color, race, religion, ancestry, national origin, sex, blindness, physical disability, or age. Now, one of the things you're going to notice is that this list seems to change from law to law. Don't worry about it. The Department of Real Estate doesn't get that picky, right? They're not going to say, well, is physical disability covered under the Rumford Act, right? You know, they're not that fussy about it. And by the way, most of these laws have been interpreted that this list is not an exclusive list, but simply a list of the types of things that are going to be prohibited. But notice some housing accommodations can be limited to senior citizens, even though the Unruh Civil Rights Act says you can't discriminate based upon age. But I guess there's a presumption that there might be a societal benefit to allow older people to live without a lot of younger people around them. So in much of California, there are different communities where you have to be over a certain age in order to live there. This includes not just mobile home parks, but there are condos, townhomes, single family homes. In the area where I am, there's a big one called the Villages, where they have condos and townhomes and single family homes, and you have to be over 55 in order to live there. I've never actually seen those places because I'm not old enough to get past the gate. But anyhow, you may notice that there are some of those. That's okay, right? You can discriminate in that. You can discriminate against people being too young. How about that? Actual damages, punitive damages. This actual damages, punitive damages, 3 times the actual damages, not less than 4,000, also has been on the state exam. Now, I have a tip for you. When you're taking the real estate licensing exam and the question involves fair housing, all of the above turns out to be a very common correct answer. It just does. So for example, there's a question on the exam about a broker who discriminates. And the question says, what would happen? What could happen to the broker who discriminates? A, the broker may be liable for paying $4,000 to the person against whom was discriminated. B, the broker could be liable for actual damages. C, the broker could have their license suspended or revoked. Or D, all of the above. Right? And that line, that paragraph comes from an all of the above question. The Rumford Act, it forbids discrimination in residential dwellings. So because brokers or businesses were regulated under the Unruh Civil Rights Act, and because we're selling and leasing residential dwellings, were covered under the Rumford Act. And notice the list is a little different. Race, color, religion, sex, marital status, national origin, ancestry. Right? Doesn't mention age, but that's been included in, in other decisions later. Complaints, this is common. Who would you file the complaint with? And it's the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. They enforce anti-discrimination laws. I've sort of mentioned that. If the law is violated, A, the owner might be forced to go through with the sale or rental, or B, the complainant is entitled to the next vacancy, or C, the owner could pay up to $10,000 in damages, or D, all of the above. If the owner of an apartment building had a question concerning race or marital status in an application, that's a violation of the Rumford Act. In renting, it is illegal to ask questions about ancestry, race, or marital status. It is illegal. Now, in another sense, when we're talking about loans, if you're applying for a loan, that question is often asked. You don't have to answer it. The difference is, in a loan, the government is trying to see if the lender is discriminating based upon marital status and ancestry. And if they don't know people's marital status and ancestry, they don't know if they're discriminating or not. But it's illegal to ask those questions on a rental application. Publicly assisted housing, just a definition. It's housing that has a tax exemption, low cost under the Federal Housing Act, loan insured by a government agency. That's just a definition. Then there's the Housing Financial Discrimination Act, sometimes known as the Holden Act. Again, the name of a politician, and it prohibits redlining. And redlining is a form of channeling or steering, right? It's a form of channeling or steering. In the old days, lenders actually had on their wall a great big map. Like the map would be a map of, let's say, the county. And it was usually a zip code type of a map. And when you looked at the map, you would see actual zip codes, and there were red lines drawn around the zip codes. And so what would happen is a couple would come in to get a loan because they found a house they would like to buy. And the lender would ask them questions, and we're going to run a credit check, and we're going to do a little bit. And at the end of the appointment, the loan agent says, "Great, I've got enough for me to get started. I'm going to do some research. I'm going to figure out whether or not we can, we're going to be able to help you." And then when the couple left, the loan agent would take a look at the address of the property that they wanted to buy, and then they'd go look at the map. And if that address was in one of the red lined areas, they don't get the loan. If it was not in one of the red line areas, then they might get the loan. And the question is, what was it about the areas that were red lined that they didn't like? And they would say, well, the defaults are higher and it's not as good of a neighborhood, and we just don't want to make loans there. Now, the banks tried to argue that they were not discriminating based upon race, color, creed, sex, marital status, national origin, or ancestry. They were simply saying, we just don't like certain zip codes, and we don't care that you're red, blue, green, black, brown. We don't care what color you are. We don't want to make loans into those zip codes. But that didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is because of the demographic makeup of those zip codes. If you understand, because of the demographic makeup of the zip code, discriminating against that zip code had the effect of discriminating against people based upon those protected groups. So it prohibits a financial institution from refusing to make a loan or offering less favorable terms based upon neighborhood characteristics like race, sex, color, religion, or national origin. Then if you're a real estate agent and you have a real estate license, you have to follow the real estate commissioner's rules and regulations. And the real estate commissioner's regulations prohibit discrimination based upon race, color, sex, religion, ancestry, physical handicap, or national origin. So we have these are state laws, right? Because the real estate commissioner's regulations are attached to the Business and Professions Code, which is a state law. And then you have these other laws, Unruh, Rumford, and Holden, which are all state laws. In addition to the state laws, there's federal law. The first one, the granddaddy, as it were, was the Civil Rights Act of 1866, passed after the Civil War. And despite the somewhat archaic language, its statement is sort of to the point, where it says that all citizens of the United States have the same right in every state and territory as is enjoyed by white citizens thereof to inherit, purge, lease, sell, hold, and convey real and personal property. That pretty much says it, doesn't it? I mean, the wording is a little old-fashioned, but it pretty much says it. Now, sometimes when a new law is passed, they decide to give it a little bit of time before they actually start enforcing it, just so people have an opportunity, to get used to it. So the 1866 law really wasn't enforced until 1968, right? 102 years later. And that was in a court case called Jones versus Mayer. As far as we have seen, there are only 2 court cases that the Department of Real Estate specifically refers to on their licensing exam. One is a case called Easton versus Strasburger, which we talk about in another class, and it has to do with the real estate licensee's duty to conduct a reasonably prudent visual inspection of the property and disclose known or should be known defects to a buyer. The other one is Jones versus Mayer. And so on the state exam, they might actually ask you, what was the court case, the Supreme Court case that tested the 1866 Act? And it was Jones versus Mayer, and it was on the 13th Amendment, which is the basis of fair housing. In addition to Jones versus Mayer, there was a Civil Rights Act of 1968, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. Smaller list, but still there it is. And the goal was to prohibit discrimination in housing transactions. The policy is fair housing for everyone throughout the United States. And it applies to single family homes offered through a real estate broker. So single family residences, and by the way, for this law's definition, and this isn't going to be on the state exam, but just if you were wondering, a condominium and a townhouse is considered a single family home because it's not a duplex or a triplex or a fourplex. So if a broker is involved, the federal law applies. Single family homes, residences owned by individuals who own more than 3 such residences. So the presumption of the law was, if you only have one house and you want to sell it yourself and not use a real estate agent, you could sell it to whoever you wanted to, even if your decision was somewhat discriminatory. But if you had 3 or more houses, like subdividers might have, of family dwellings of 5 or more units. Now, 5 or more is the somewhat of the definition of an apartment building. And when residential real estate becomes commercial residential real estate is at 5. Dwellings owned or operated by the federal government, dwellings having loans made or insured by the federal government, federally regulated and insured lenders. Virtually all first loans on real property are by federally regulated and insured lenders. Complaints are filed with the Department of Housing and Urban Development within 1 year, and the Attorney General would be the one that would enforce it. If a person is discriminated against, they could A, file a complaint under the Civil Rights Act of 1968, B, institute a private action in state or federal court for injunctive relief, or C, sue for actual damages. All of the above. If the owner refuses an offer on the listed property for the listed price because of the broker's race, A, the broker could sue for a commission. B, the broker could advise the buyer of the buyer's rights to complain to HUD. C, the broker could warn the seller that the seller is violating the Fair Housing Act, or D, all of the above. A lot of all of the above answers in fair housing. Panic selling, block busting, and panic peddling. Right? Trying to get people to sell by telling them the wrong people are moving into the neighborhood. Have you seen who's been moving in the neighborhood? We all know what happens when they move in. Maybe you better sell now before they take over the neighborhood. This violates like all sorts of different laws. It violates the state law, it violates the federal law. There are examples on the state exam where it's an integrated neighborhood and the broker is running it, sell now, save equity, or is modifying their commission depending upon whether or not, depending upon somebody's race. That's a violation of all these laws. And this is, I know these are sort of stating the same thing, but it's doing it in different ways. And I'm repeated them because this is different ways the Department of Real Estate. But if you're telling owners that minority groups are moving in the area and values will decrease, the quality of schools is going to decrease, and crime will decrease, that's a violation of all of these laws. And you, if you're a broker, could be disciplined by the real estate commissioner. Fair housing in practice. This is sort of a list of things that have appeared on the state exam. Most of this, I think, should be common sense, but who knows anymore what that means. One of the questions that the first bullet really refers to, the owner says, you're going on a listing appointment, and the owner says, well, I like you and I'm going to give you the listing, but I just want you to know I don't want you to sell my house to certain groups, certain protected groups. So the question is, what should you do? Should you go ahead and take the listing and do what the seller wants? It doesn't sound right. Should you just say, okay, sure, go ahead and take the listing, but then ignore the instructions of the seller? Or what does the Department of Real Estate want you to do? They want you to refuse to take the listing. They want. If I've been a property manager for a long time, managing apartment buildings, could I reasonably come to the conclusion that single male tenants cause more damage to the units than either single female tenants or married couples? Is it possible that if I've been managing apartments for a long time, I could reasonably come to that conclusion? So if that's true, does that mean I could charge the single male tenants a higher security deposit because I know they're more likely to, break stuff? And the answer is no, because I'm discriminating based upon marital status and sex. If a broker as an agent of the owner takes a larger deposit from single men than from single women or couples, or because of people of different ethnicities, that's discrimination. Race, creed, or color of a buyer or tenant is not a material fact, and you should not discuss it even if asked by the principal. Listing a home for one price for minorities but accepting other prices, you might guess, is a violation of the law. Now, sometimes what the Department of Real Estate does is they ask you a question that involves somebody from a protected class, And the question is, well, let's say the seller was a member of a protected class. And when could you refuse to list their house? Now, whatever answer you pick has to not have anything to do with their being a member of a protected class. For example, if they wanted a price substantially higher than what the market would bear, that would be a reason that you could reject listing the property, and it doesn't really have anything to do with their protected status. If a broker tells employees to direct their advertising to women or to charge more rent to certain ethnic or religious groups, that's a violation. That's a violation. Implicit discrimination, in fact, this is something that is being added to the requirements for continuing education. It's being included now. And this is something that's not openly discriminatory, but would result in discriminatory effects, implicit discrimination. Again, the Department of Real Estate has questions about Black prospects, Chicano prospects. Yes, that's the way they phrased it on the state exam. And how would you pick homes to show them? And the answer is just like anyone else. But you could refuse a home to show a home to a minority prospect if the owner is out of town and said, don't show it to anybody while I'm gone. Because again, that has nothing to do with their protected status. If a Black buyer inquired about a house in a Black neighborhood, you should assume that they like the architectural style of the house, not necessarily that they want to be in a Black neighborhood. That's the Department of Real Estate's phrase is colorblind. Discrimination includes blockbusting, hiring people from only a specific ethnic group, racial deed restrictions. They're unenforceable. One of my agents was researching a property that was built in the downtown area in the 1930s, single family home. And there were CC&Rs, conditions, covenants, and restrictions, but they were really, really small. And there's no homeowner association, there's no tennis court or common area. So she was like, that's weird. And she started to read them and got angry and called me because she wanted to know, what's going on here. And essentially there was a paragraph that listed all the kinds of people you were never allowed to sell property to in the future. That's what the CC&Rs were about. And because of, without getting into the specifics, but she would not personally have been allowed to buy this house for 3 different reasons that were on this list. Right? And she wanted to know, how is it, that this still exists? And my answer is changing because they're actually trying to do something about it. But at the time, the answer was, this is a public record. It was made a public record back in the 1930s. And there's a big stamp that the title and escrow companies put on these things that say this is not enforceable, just ignore it. But it's still there, and people find it offensive that it's still there, even though it's not enforceable. So there's actually a movement, this won't be on the state exam in California, to purge some of that language from these old covenants and conveyances. It's unenforceable. If a deed includes racial identities of the parties, which they rarely do, it can be rewritten. Discrimination is unenforceable, illegal, and unlawful. Department of Real Estate says colorblind, absolutely free from bias. That's the goal. A private dwelling for sale by owner doesn't have to have the equal opportunity housing symbol. You'll notice that most real estate agents, if they're following the rules, have the equal housing opportunity logo on their marketing materials, which is a requirement. An agent's license cannot be revoked or suspended under federal law, only by the Department of Real Estate. So even if you're guilty of theft and crimes and discrimination and all that sort of stuff, and you've been fined by the federal government, fined by the state government, that still doesn't do anything to your license until the Department of Real Estate does something to your license. Mobile home parks can have an adult only policy. It's very common. In fact, you can even search in our multiple listing service for age restrictions in terms of, not just mobile home parks, but condominiums and other areas as well. Showing minority prospects properties in segregated areas only is called steering and is illegal. So what you're not supposed to do is to look at a couple and say, I'll bet they'll be happy over here because there's more people like them over here. So I'm going to push them to look at homes over there, right? That's called steering. One way that I've sort of, summarized this is that blockbusting is a fair housing violation that involves sellers. It's when agents are soliciting listings by telling homeowners the wrong people are moving in. Redlining is when lenders are discriminating, and steering is discriminating against buyers by trying to steer them in certain places. The Department of Real Estate often has questions about, does this ad violate the fair housing laws? How about that ad? And so here are some guides. For example, one of them is you shouldn't say no Section 8. Now, if you don't know what Section 8 is, Section 8 is a government subsidy for people that are renting properties. Now, I've done a lot of rentals. I've had clients say, I don't want Section 8. And I said, I understand, or it's a hassle, right? It wasn't necessarily that they didn't like the people that were going to come through, but dealing with it's a hassle. And they would rather not go through the hassle. And I said, I understand why you're saying that, but we can't say no Section 8. And so when somebody would call and say, do you accept Section 8 renters? I would say, yeah, of course we do. It's illegal not to. Yes, we do. But what usually happens with Section 8, and by the way, I've explained to some landlords that 80% of the rent is paid by the county, right? Paid through the system, which is something of a guarantee, right? You understand, Section 8 people generally don't default on their rent payments as much, right? So there's an upside to it as well. But a lot of times what happens is that when you come up with a rental agreement and you turn it into the county, to the person that's handling it, they oftentimes come back and say, we think the rent ought to be this, and it's a lower amount. Landlord's under no obligation to change the rent, which means we start over. You can't run an ad that says no children, or adults only. You can't run an ad that says no unmarried persons or Christians only. And this is a big one, because I have clients that do this, and they say, we don't want pets, right? We make sure, put it in the ad, no pets, we don't want pets. I'm like, wait a second, no pets. See, what happens is, first of all, you ought to accommodate people with disabilities. But secondly, there are people that are testing this. So they're reading rental ads, and they'll call you up and they'll say, I see, no pets. Is that a requirement, no pets? Or, I have a dog, and you say, no pets. Then the next thing you get is a summons. And what the problem is, the person that called you was blind and has a seeing eye dog. And now you're going to have to explain in front of a court why you wouldn't rent to somebody who's blind and has a seeing eye dog. This is difficult to explain. So what we do in practice is we don't mention anything about pets. By the way, if somebody has pets, you could charge a higher security deposit. That's not illegal. You could charge more rent. That's not illegal. You can limit the number and size of the pets to some degree. That's not necessarily illegal, but don't run an ad that says no pets, because you'll be talking to lawyers at some point. Maximum number, you can't limit family size, right? No felons, you can't say, no, I don't know why anybody would ever say that, but you can't do that. You can't express a preference for adults, couples, or singles. By the way, related to this, not one of the specifics, is you shouldn't say it's, if you said across the street from St. Joseph's Church. See, that's expressing a preference for somebody that wants to go to that church. Walking distance to the senior center, right? Any of those sort of things where the advertisement seems to be inferring that the property is preferable based upon race, color, creed, sex, national origin, or ancestry, right, is something that you need to avoid. Examples that are permissible: family room, mother-in-law suite, we now say ADU, but whatever, bachelor apartment, master bedroom, 2-bedroom, great view, 4th floor walk-in desirable neighborhood, wheelchair ramp, walk to bus stops, kosher meals available, chapel with a, these have all been ruled to be permissible. And by the way, one of the things I point out to my landlords is that smoking is not a protected class. So you can say, and by the way, SOBE should say sober only. I'll have to fix that. You can say that. Smoking and drinking, not protected classes. And so you can say no smoking. I don't want any smokers. I don't want anyone who drinks. That's legal. The Americans with Disabilities Act is a law that is designed to remove architectural barriers. And so basically, so that handicapped persons are given equal access to public buildings. So it has to involve a building where the public is expected to come and go. And a lot of it has to do with employers. And most of the time on the state exam, all they ask is it requires the removal of some architectural barriers when readily achievable. That's the most common question. Equal Credit Opportunity Act deals with credit, and it would discourage discrimination in lending. And it provides that lenders cannot determine a borrower's credit worthiness based upon sex, marital status, family planning, or part-time income. Real estate practice. Now, this is not intended to be everything in the practice of real estate. It's just sort of a subject that, I don't know, this is where I put everything. And these are just things that have been on the state exam. Agents would question the seller as to why they're listing a house. I teach this when I'm teaching agents who are going on a listing appointment. One of the questions you want to ask is, why are you thinking of selling your house at this time, right? Because their level of motivation is going to influence how cooperative they're going to be, and a lot of different things. Open listings is something we'll talk about in another class, but we don't advertise. First of all, nobody does this, right? People don't do open listings. But if you did one, and the reason the Department of Real Estate asks about it, because if you were to read an old textbook on real estate, you would see an open listing is a type of listing. It's just that it's not a type of listing you're ever going to see in the business. And it's open, which means that there's no obligation to pay the agent a commission. Whoever finds a buyer gets paid, so we don't advertise them. Policy manual, they do like to ask about that. It's just an outline of office procedure. Still occasionally, but not as often, they want to know what these advertising terms are: classified display and reading notice. Newspapers, right? I mean, maybe if you Google search to see what they look like, there's still some newspapers, but I guess I see people reading newspapers. I don't know. This AIDA has been around forever, I think. The 4 elements of a sales presentation: attention, interest, desire, and action. Offices specializing in real estate resale should have a flow of listings. There's an old saying in real estate: you have to list to last in real estate. And that's because the leverage in listings is much greater than working with buyers. You could have 5 or 10 or 15 listings. I've had more than 15 listings at a time. Didn't kill me. 5 buyers might probably be too much for anyone to work with. Commissions are determined by an agreement. And the phrase desk cost and company dollar on the state exam with some frequency. And the thing about desk cost that makes it a little bit confusing is it has nothing to do with the cost of desks, right? But it's an old school term. Back in the old days, the typical real estate agent would get up, put on their suit, get in their car, drive to the real estate office, go and sit at the desk the broker has given them. On that desk was a great big heavy landline phone, and your contacts were in a thing called a Rolodex, where you could put people's business cards. And the real estate agent would be sitting at the desk, picking up the phone and making calls. And then if you had an appointment, you would go and then come back to your desk. So when a broker, let's say the broker has 10 desks, and the broker is, let's say their overhead is $10,000 a month. So in order for the broker to break even, the broker is going to need to earn $1,000 per month per desk. And if each of the desks produced $1,000 a month to the broker, then the broker would break even. And so some offices would charge you $1,000 a month unless your sales exceeded that amount. And it isn't the gross commission, it would be the company dollar. Now, on the state exam, one of the things you need to know is that, first of all, this isn't 1950 anymore. And there are offices that have hundreds of agents, but not very many desks. And I work for a company called eXp Realty, which is a cloud-based company. Because nowadays, most of our business is done at coffee shops, and you could work from home. It's out there, not in here. But what on the state exam, when they ask you a question about desk costs, it's the total operating expenses, not divided by the number of desks, right? That was the old school way, but divided by the number of salespeople. And so what the broker would need to know is that they're getting X amount of money per salesperson on average in order to cover their expenses. And the money that the broker gets is called the company dollar. And the company dollar is the amount of money that the broker gets after the salesperson has been paid. Now, most real estate companies have a progressive commission plan, which means that you get a higher percentage and it goes up over time, capping out at certain levels. Some of them never cap, right? And what I mean by cap is the company I work for, eXp Realty, has a 16,000 company dollar cap for a typical solo agent at eXp. What that means is that if the baseline commission split is 80-20, with the agent getting 80 and eXp, the broker, getting 20. Now, if you sold $3.2 million worth of real estate in 1 year, and the commission side was 2.5%, which is around about typical, that would produce $80,000 in gross commission income. And eXp would get 20%, which is $16,000. And what that would mean is that the rest of your transactions for that year, you don't have to pay eXp any more money. The company dollar is capped at 16,000. Now, I have what's called a mega icon team with eXp Realty. I have agents from San Diego all the way throughout California, and agents that are on the team have a $4,000 cap. A $4,000 cap, which would mean the equivalent of selling an $800,000 house at a 2.5% commission, that would produce $20,000. And if EXP got 20%, that would be $4,000, and you don't owe EXP any more money for the rest of the year. This is one of the advantages of not having all the desks, right? Not having the overhead. So company dollar is like most real estate companies have a baseline commission. When I was at Keller Williams, it was 70-30. At Century 21, it was 60-40. But EXP, it's 80-20, but there's a cap. And so company dollar is, if it's 80-20, is the 20, right? It's how much of the gross commission is the agent getting versus how much is the company getting, and it's the company dollar that pays the desk cost. The operating expenses are paid out of the company dollar. But then other companies also charge you. I was talking to a guy today who the Keller Williams office he's at charges him $285 a month, right? In addition to commission splits and things like that, that also varies, and that's often done to cover the desk cost. They actually call it sometimes a desk fee at different offices, which is why I like the cloud-based company, because I don't have to pay a desk fee. Many state exams ask questions about the definition of a desk cost and what the definition of company dollar is. Professional associations. Membership is voluntary. Voluntary. You don't have to join. There are no racial restrictions, which might make sense, but we'll see what you mean. You'll see what I mean. The big one, and sometimes in our industry, this is referred to as the union. You know, they don't like it that they're called a union, but I call them a union too. It's the National Association of Realtors. And their copyrighted designation is the word realtor. And a way to think about this is, let's say you wanted to be a commercial truck driver. Now, there is a union called the Teamsters Union, which many truck drivers are members of. But the question is, do you have to join that union just to drive trucks? And the answer is no, you don't have to drive the union. Don't have to join the union to drive the trucks. What do you need to be a commercial truck driver? The answer is you need the license. And if you've got the license, you could drive the trucks. Might you want to join a union? Some jobs you won't get if you're not a member of the union. They have job boards, they have insurance programs, they have stuff maybe that you're interested in. But if you're a truck driver, but not a member of the Teamsters, you wouldn't go around calling yourself a Teamster, because you're not a Teamster, you're a truck driver. Teamsters have joined the union. So the National Association is the union for residential real estate agents. And if you're planning to sell real estate, 1 to 4 units, residential property, you're probably going to have to join the union. And the union dues where I'm a member are about, let's round it up, $700 a year. Why would you want to join the union? Well, you don't get access to the multiple listing service unless you're a member of the Association of Realtors. You don't get access to the forms we use, the contracts and things like that, unless you're a member of the Association of Realtors. You don't get that key that unlocks homes when the owner is not there unless you're a member of the Association of Realtors. This isn't like getting a national real estate license. It just means you join the local union. There's a National Association, a California Association, and then every county has their own association. They have a code of ethics. And there's a definition of what ethics are here. And what happens if you violated the code of ethics of the National Association of Realtors? They could kick you out of the union. Right? You're not going to go to jail necessarily unless what you did was illegal anyhow. But if they throw you out of the union, you're no longer in the multiple listing service. You don't get to use the contracts. You got problems. And they hold hearings, right, to see if they're going to throw somebody out. And they have sections about protecting clients and the public and other realtors. This phrase, under all is the land, sometimes appears on the state exam, and they want you to know that that's from the preamble to the National Association of Realtors. Other professional organizations. This is not a complete list. I actually went to a union barbecue recently, and there's a whole bunch of things. But some of the ones that they have mentioned on the state exam, some of these organizations, one is called NAREB, N-A-R-E-B, which is predominantly African-American real estate agents, but anybody can join. And rather than saying realtor, they're called the realtist. Now, if I wanted to join, can I join? And the answer is yes, I've been a member. It's open to anybody. Remember, there are no racial restrictions. There's the Institute of Real Estate Management, and their big thing is the Certified Property Manager designation, which you have to take a class in order to get it. There's just a couple of things I've thrown in about property management, because why not? This is talking about it. You're not supposed to get kickbacks if you're a property manager. And the commission of a leasing agent is the total rent over the term of the lease. So a leasing agent, and a leasing agent isn't necessarily property management. So leasing agents are agents who find tenants for rentals. And typically you get something, a percentage of the rent. It's common in California, if you negotiate a 1-year lease of a residential property, for the commission to be 1 month's worth of rent, which by the way is about 6%. There's also a management agreement. Now, property management is more than leasing. So for example, eXp Realty, you could do commercial real estate and you could do leasing, but we don't do property management except in our commercial division. Property management means you're collecting the rents, right? Which we don't do, right? Leasing, we don't collect the rent. We write the lease, we find the tenant, we screen the tenant, we do all that, but the check is paid to the owner, not to us. And we don't manage the property afterwards. But typically, if there was a property manager, they would get a flat fee plus a percentage of the gross income. There's NAREP, the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Do you think you have to be Hispanic in order to join NAREP? And the answer is no, anybody can join. There's the Asian Real Estate Association of America. Do you have to be Asian in order to join the Asian Real Estate Association of America? And the answer is no, anybody can join. The loan agent and I that went to this group meeting, I've been also a member of FARIBA, which is a Filipino Association of Real Estate Professionals, and there's VNARP, a Vietnamese National Association of Real Estate Professionals, and everybody wanted us to join also, but there's no racial restrictions. Anybody can become a member. How about this one? There's a professional association called the Women's Council of Realtors. Do you have to be a woman to be a member of the Women's Council of Realtors? The answer is no. I'm a member of the Women's Council of Realtors. Anybody can join. There's just all these different associations that are committed to enhancing the business opportunities and success of real estate professionals. The Department of Real Estate likes to ask a question about a CCIM, which is the Certified Commercial Investment Member. And what they're asking on the state exam is, what would be, if you were doing commercial or investment real estate, what would be the professional designation that you would likely get? And the answer is it's a CCIM. And you have to have worked in the commercial real estate industry for a while, but that's the commercial designation. Guy who took the test just last week, passed it by the way, mentioned that there was a multiple listing service question. And what the multiple listing service is, it's a way that we pool listings from all over the state of California. And that gives, it can be used as a marketing tool. It also establishes legal relationships for compensation and cooperation. So earlier today, I have a big team and I train and mentor real estate agents, particularly new real estate agents. And one of them was asking me about there's what we call an off-market property, and she has a buyer who wants to make an offer. The issue with off-market, what that means is that it's not in the multiple listing service. And I pointed out to her that we need an additional form in this transaction that says we're going to be paid a commission. Because when I ask what is the most important part of the multiple listing service, the answer from my point of view as a real estate broker is that's where it says you get paid a commission if you find a buyer for a property. That's where it says it. So if you're writing an offer on a for sale by owner or an expired listing or some property that's not actually on the being marketed right now, the starting point is there's no agreement to pay you anything. And it gives this dissemination of listing information. A salesperson gets access through his or her broker. Economic theory. We're moving on to something completely different. The Department of Real Estate is not following the news. They're not. I attended a seminar today by the National Association of Realtors on the state of the housing market, the Department of Real Estate, and they weren't watching. And even if somebody was, they're not taking that information and using it to modify the licensing exam. The Department of Real Estate generally does not ask questions on their exam unless whatever it is they're asking about can be found in a textbook or a readily available government publication. And so you don't need to be up on what's happening in the current housing market or business cycle right now. They're not going to ask about that on the state exam. Now, as a new real estate agent, it would be good for you to be up on that stuff, but the Department of Real Estate doesn't care. They do want you to know that we tend to go through a business cycle. And that's where we go through a recovery, prosperity, recession, depression, and that sort of thing, which to me looks more like a wave than a cycle, but what do I know? I guess you could make it a circle too, but that's how it's usually expressed as the 4 phases. Now, on the right-hand side, it's a similar kind of thing, but it's a slightly different chart. And what it shows is the different segments of this and what generally happens to the number of sales, to prices, to inventory, and to the building of new homes. So when the market starts into a downturn, sales drop, but prices drop too. Right now, prices are not dropping a lot. And by the way, the projection for 2023 is that nationwide prices are going to be up 2 or 3%. Of course, who knows what the future is going to bring. Inventory is going up. Those are all signs of a downturn. And right now, new home builders are having difficulty selling new homes, so they've stopped building new homes. When the market hits a bottom, and you don't actually know the market has hit bottom until it starts to go up, sales have flattened out. Prices have flattened out, inventory is flattened out, and construction of new homes has dropped. As the market recovers, sales start to go up, prices start to go up, but inventory goes down. And that's because construction has been down because the market's been flat. So once it takes off again, all of a sudden prices start going up because we have more demand than we have supply. And then when it tops out, sales flatten out and price flattens out and inventory flattens out, but builders build and build and build because everything is, selling at a high price. You need to know for the state exam that these are the 4 phases. Very common question. When the business cycle is in the prosperity phase, then real estate cycle is in a high level of sales transactions. We've been there. Usually, a general business recession precedes a decline in the real estate market. And when business activity increases, the market lags behind. in a textbook, historically, that's true. But for example, in 2020, COVID hits. It's not exactly a recession, but boy, the economy stalled, but real estate shot up. Generally, historically, real estate follows but does not lead. In other words, the economy goes down, then real estate goes down, then the economy picks up, then real estate picks up, but that's not always happening. And in fact, what's been happening more recently is the real estate market leads the economy. But on the state exam, remember old questions from old textbooks. When the frequency of the cycle increases, so that we're going through these phases much faster, long-term investments are not as attractive because it's very hard to predict where the market is going to be in 5 or 10 years because the things are speeding up too much. The trend of general economic inflation will be to the benefit of a borrower to a debtor, not to a lender. Why is that? Well, let's say I'm using the old school savings method. And the old school savings method is I have a great big coffee can with a plastic lid. And I go to work and I come home from work and I take the money I've earned that day and I throw it in the coffee can and I slide it under my bed. So when inflation is occurring, and right now the reasons for inflation occurring have a lot to do with other things, right? You understand that there's a lot more profit taking, there's been supply chain issues, it's not a normal inflationary period. It just isn't, right? And you can see, because it's happening in a whole bunch of other countries at the same time, generally for similar reasons. But in a general sense, when inflation is occurring, what it means is that there is more money and fewer things. So it would take more, the dollar, let me put it this way. When inflation generally is occurring, it is not because things are worth more, it's because the money is worth less. As a general rule. Now, don't send me emails about what's going on in today's inflation because things are different. Right? I mean, this is just a general statement that appears sometimes on the state exam. So I've got all my money in a coffee can under my bed, and inflation is occurring. It's effectively like my coffee can is leaking. Every day that money is in the coffee can, it's effectively, there's less money because it'll buy less stuff. So I take the money out of the coffee can and I buy a house with the money. Now, when inflation is occurring, usually the price of the house is going up as well, which is why oftentimes real estate is said to be a hedge against inflation. Now, inflation does not help it does not help lenders, it helps borrowers. And the reason that inflation would be more to the borrower's benefit to a lender's benefit is, let's say the lender lends me money at 4% interest, but inflation is at 7%. Is the lender even making anything? Because I'm paying them 4% interest, but the value of the money has gone down by 7%. You understand? They're not necessarily breaking even. Also, the money that I borrowed was worth more than when I paid it back. The Department of Real Estate likes to ask this question: if there's inflation occurring, who is benefited? Is it the borrower? Is it the lender? And the answer is it would more be the borrower's benefit because the value of the property is going to go up and the money that you're paying back isn't worth as much as when you borrowed it. When it says the index number of prices, it's usually talking about the consumer price index. And if the consumer price index is going up, it means the exchange value of the dollar is going down. Rising prices is what lenders are looking for if they don't have a down payment. The federal government can decrease inflationary pressures by increasing the income tax. There's what's called fiscal policy and monetary policy. And fiscal policy, if there's too many dollars in the economy, then that's what drives inflation most of the time. Then if there were fewer dollars, then there would be less inflation. Hedges against inflation would include ownership of real property. A decrease in the level of prices means that's deflation, means that the money value is going up. Inflation is that the value of the money is going down. Deflation is that the value of the money is going up. In inflationary periods, investors don't take long-term positions because capital will erode. That means the money they're earning is not worth the money they invested. Short-term investments often provide a higher yield, especially if you're lending money, you like high interest rates. You like high interest rates, and investment properties, and how do they determine the capitalization rates and the rate of return that investors want? It's often tied to interest rates. Which interest rates go up, then investment yields go up too. Tight money, that's a phrase you may see. It means high interest rates. Tight money is code for high interest rates. If the financing has an alienation clause is a clause that says that the loan cannot be assumed by the buyer. The buyer is going to have to get new financing. In a tight money market, the best form is usually trust deed securities. Are we in a really tight money market right now? The average interest rate in the United States since the 1970s is closer to it's almost 7%. It's over 6%. There are videos someplace of me doing home buying seminars and teaching real estate financing, and I was using 8% as an example of an interest rate, 8%. There was a time in California in the United States in the 1980s where interest rates crossed 17%. That's a tight money market. So if interest rates were at 8, 9, or 10%, and you had money, you didn't use it all to buy crypto, you might be interested in lending money on real estate, trust deed securities, because interest rates are 8, 9, 10. I don't know where your money is. Is it making 8, 9, 10% a year? Oftentimes not. If it's a tight money market, sellers take back a loan. In other words, when interest rates are really, really high, people have trouble qualifying, and they would rather use some of their down payment money to buy down their interest rate. And so there was a typical loan called an 80-10-10, where the borrower would get an 80% loan from a bank, and then the seller would give the borrower a short-term 10% down, 10% loan, so that the buyer only needed 10%. If it's a tight money market, more loans are assumed. And land contracts, which we talk about in another class, are used more often because that's seller financing. Land contracts are seller financing. Investment. Capital turnover in real estate investments is slower than the average commodity. Investments in stocks and bonds are liquid, and investments in income property are not very liquid. Now, when we say that an investment is liquid, what we mean is how long would it take us to get our money out of this investment? If all of my money is in stocks and bonds, and even crypto for that matter, and I wanted to get my money out, how long would it take me to get my money out? And the answer is like 3 days, 3 business days. That's it. Right, I could go into my Ameritrade account and just hit sell, 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 sell. Just keep hitting sell until it was all gone. And in 3 days, I have all the money. That's pretty liquid. Now, if my money is in an apartment building and I want to get my money out of the apartment building, well, that's way harder. I mean, I just can't get the money out in 3 days. I got to sell the apartment building. Well, that could take a long time. Now, if you had money to invest, there were two investments, and both investments had a 5% rate of return. And one investment, you could get your money out whenever you wanted to. But the other investment, you'd have to leave your money in it for a really long time. Which investment would you take? Well, most people would take the one where they could get their money out whenever they wanted to. I mean, all things being equal, you might need the money. Why not? So when would you put your money in the investment that you couldn't get the money out whenever you wanted to? And the answer is only if it had a higher rate of return. So if the get your money out anytime investment was 5%, but the long term was 7%, you might say, well, I don't really think I'm going to need the money for a while, and I'd rather make a higher rate of interest. That's why the return from investments in real property should be higher than the return from investments in bonds and things like that, because they lack liquidity. An economic characteristic of real property is that it's a long-term investment. I've had people say, I don't care about the market going up and down, right? You know, I'm going to keep it for 30 years at least, right? I'll wait it out. It's not timing the market for some people, it's time in the market. If you're managing an investment portfolio, reserves, you wouldn't want all of your money in one place. Liquidity, some of your money you'd like to be able to get your hands on when you needed it, and diversification. So you'd keep some money in reserve, some would be liquid, some not as liquid, and diversification means you're not going to put all of your money in retail space in Manteca, right? Because it's just too much in one spot. You'd like to diversify it. In normal economic times, whatever that means, long-term investments have more risk than short-term investments, and that's because it's hard to predict where things are going to be in 20 years. It's even hard to predict where they're going to be in 3 to 5 years, but if we can see a trend, we have a better chance. And a depreciation allowance, which is an advantage of real estate, is a tax deduction you get to take on the income made from certain kinds of real property. Ownership. An increase in the desire to own property would cause people to buy real estate. That seems pretty obvious. But the Department of Real Estate is sneakier than that sentence would show. I guess that's the best word I could come up with at the time. The question on the state exam goes like this. Which of the following would create demand for real estate? Everybody get the question? That's how it was worded on the state exam. Which of the following would create demand for real estate? A, increased income levels. B, increased income levels. What am I doing? Decreased interest rates. A is increased income levels. B is decreased interest rates. C is an increased desire to own. And D was all of the above. All of the above, right? Remember, create demand in real estate. A, increased incomes. B, decreased interest rates. C, increased desire. D, all of the above. And what a lot of people are inclined to do is pick D, all of the above, and that's the wrong answer. It'd be marked wrong. And the reason is that money does not create demand. In other words, if there's a country and people are starving in the country, and the question is what creates the demand for food? Is it all the money they have? Is it the low interest rates on a loan, their ability to borrow? Or is it their desire to eat that creates the demand? So economics would separate that which creates the demand from that which implements the demand. Money implements the demand, but it doesn't create the demand. Desire creates the demand. Buying a home for financial enhancement is a secondary objective, I guess, right? That's how the Department of Real Estate wants it. But, most people are thinking, this is going to be our retirement, right? Because most people that buy real estate, that's where they get money when they retire. But again, it's where do you want to live during that time period? Equity. A lot of our concepts and laws come from medieval England, medieval England. And so in England, they had this system where if you borrowed money on your house and you did not pay off your loan, you lost your house. Now, you might be saying, well, isn't that the system we have today? Well, let me just make it clearer. Let's say you borrowed money on a house and you paid off 90% of the loan. You still lost the house if you couldn't pay back the other 10%. Even though the lender could have sold the house, gotten all their money, and given you what was left over, they didn't do that. They just, the deal is you pay off the loan on time or you lose the house. You didn't pay off the loan on time, you lose the house. And the powers that be decided that that really wasn't very equitable. And what would be fair, what would be equitable, is to give to the borrower the difference between the value of the house and the amount of the loan. That's why it's called equity. So equity is what is today's market value minus your debt. Now, when you first buy a house, the difference between the value of the property and the amount you owe is called your down payment. Day one, it's your down payment. In your principles book or practices book, it may refer to this as purchase equity. It's the equity you paid for, the difference between the loan and the amount of your, the value and the amount of the loan. Over time, hopefully the value is going to go up and you're going to make the payments and your debt is going to go down, and the difference between those two is equity. The difference between the loans and the value of the property. Owner's interest above and beyond all liens. Cash provided by a buyer. Equity funds. When an investor borrows funds at an interest rate lower than the rate of return on the investment, it is a increase in equity yield called leverage, also known as trading on equity. Let's say interest rates are 5%, but the appreciation of property is 10. Now, that goes up and down, but the annual appreciation in California, properties had the tendency to double like every 10 years, which, by the way, is about 10% a year. But let's just go with me on this. So let's say I have $500,000 cash. I could buy one property for $500,000, pay cash, and it goes up 10%. I made $50,000. Another option is I could buy 5 properties, putting $100,000 down on each of the 5, borrowing $400,000 and 80% loan. And if all of them go up 10%, I've made $250,000. And so I get all of the appreciation produced equity. Right, and so if my rate of return, in other words, if the appreciation of the property exceeds the interest rate, and by the way, some of the interest is deductible in my tax return, right? There are other things that take into consideration. I might have a depreciation deduction if it's the right kind of property. So that's called trading on equity, when your cost of borrowing is less than the appreciation rate. Leverage, meaning uses, have you ever heard the phrase OPM? That stands for other people's money. That's what leverage is, using other people's money. When the value of the property increases, the trustor, remember that's the borrower, benefits because the equity increases. And usually when we buy real estate, some of it is debt and some of it is equity funds, in other words, your down payment. Other little things that have been on the state exam, a long-term ground lease is like having an annuity. An annuity is an annual income. Supposing you owned the land that, I don't know, Apple computer leased for 80 years, 50 years from you. This is like getting an annuity. It's like getting an annual income. Well secured, unless Apple's going to go away. Gross domestic product is the measure of goods and services. Been a question. When it goes up, income is going up and home sales increase. What is a seller's market? What is a buyer's market? Well, a seller's market is when there are fewer parcels for sale and more people want to buy it, prices go up. When do most people sell their house? In a buyer's market or a seller's market? When do most people sell their house? And the answer is most people sell their house in a buyer's market. Really? That's why it's called a buyer's market. Because in a buyer's market, there's more sellers than there are buyers. Prices go down. So most people aren't selling in a seller's market. That's why it's a seller's market. Just fewer people are selling. Okay. So when do most people buy a house? And the answer is they buy a house in a seller's market, not a buyer's market. That's what makes it a seller's market. It's because that's when people are buying. They don't buy in a buyer's market. They wait until it becomes a seller's market. Now, many of you may have noticed an irony in that situation. When would be a good time to buy? It's called a buyer's market. By the way, Warren Buffett, when back in 2008 and the market was tanking and everybody was running, the big investors were not running. They were buying up and buying and buying and buying and buying. Because remember that business cycle, what goes down comes up. And I knew investors, when interest rates are really high, is it a good time to buy? Is it a good time to buy when interest rates are really high? A lot of people say, oh no, I don't want to buy now. Interest rates are really high. The savvy investors buy when interest rates are high. Do you know why? Because all the amateurs have backed out of the market because interest rates are high. But they'll come in and buy. Either they have cash or they'll go ahead and get a loan with high interest rates because you know what happens? Eventually the interest rates come down and they refinance. But they save hundreds of thousands of dollars on the purchase. If you wait for interest rates to go down and then you, like the rest of the herd, all rush to buy, prices are really, really high. There's 20 offers. People are offering hundreds of thousands of dollars over the list price and still not getting it. In the height of the market in 2021, I wrote offers that were $500,000 over the list price. We had no contingencies for appraisal or loan. My buyer had 50% down, $500,000 over the list price, and the listing agent said, good try. You guys weren't even close. You weren't even close to buying this house, right? Because people wait when interest rates are really, really low, then everybody wants to buy. I'm just saying, right? You need to understand, because when you get into real estate and people start to say, well, it's a terrible time to buy, that means it's a good time to buy. By the way, when you hear it's a terrible time to get into real estate, that means it's a good time to get into real estate because other people are getting out or they're not doing anything. Just saying. When interest rates on bonds increase, the supply of funds for real estate loans decreases. I'll discuss that in a minute. The purchasing power of the dollar is price indexes like the consumer price index would reference the purchasing power of the dollar. All right, types of lenders. We really don't have savings and loans. I haven't noticed that the Department of Real Estate has been asking about them. It's a historical thing, right? They were called thrifts, right? But there it is, it's on my chart. We've got commercial banks, that would be like Bank of America, whatever. In fact, I may redo it. Credit unions are now much more prominent than, there aren't savings and loans anymore. There's mortgage companies, there's mutual savings banks, and there are insurance companies. And these represent the primary mortgage market. And I would call that the retail market, where loans originate. And you'll hear that loan agents are sometimes called LOs, which stands for a loan originator. So when you get a loan from a loan agent, that loan agent is originating a loan. That's retail. The secondary mortgage market is where existing loans are bought and sold. That's wholesale. So once the loan agent makes the loan, they sell the loan on the secondary market, which is where they get the money to make another loan. Institutional lenders are highly regulated. They use intermediaries like mortgage companies. They're not subject to usury laws. They can charge whatever interest they want. They make DVA, which is the Department of Veterans Affairs, and FHA loans. Private lenders aren't regulated. They can do what they want. They lend their own money, but they may be limited on how much interest they can charge, except if they use a broker. They're not, and they don't make FHA and VA loans. Institutional lenders they get their money. Most of their money comes from people's savings, right? They put it in the bank, put it in the credit union, and they're a primary source of funds for real estate. And one of them is insurance companies. And some people find this odd because, I don't know, have you ever had an insurance company lend you money to buy a house? Well, they don't usually lend money to buy houses. But there's a video I have on my YouTube channel about commercial lending, and I have a commercial lender, talk about it. And he's always talking about insurance companies, life insurance companies. They make large loans on better type commercial properties. Let's say you wanted to buy a commercial property and you needed to borrow $150 million. Right? That's how much you need in order to buy this commercial property. Who's got that kind of money? Who's got $150 million just sitting around looking for a place to go? How about a life insurance company? You think they got 150 million sitting around? That's chump change to the life insurance company. They lend large amounts for the longest period of time. They use mortgage brokers to find the loans. The life insurance companies don't have their own loan agents. They sometimes get a lower interest rate, but that's because they often make participation loans, which is where the life insurance company says, oh, great, we want to be a partner with you in that commercial development. And you say, what do you mean partner? I don't want a partner. All I want to do is borrow 150 million. And they say, well, if you want, what are you going to do? Right? Not everybody's got 150 million. Right? If you want that kind of money, you're going to have to cut us into the deal. They learned this, by the way, from organized crime. Savings and loans, not a lot to say. This is more of a historical thing. They were a primary source. They had a large loan to value ratio. I haven't seen a savings and loan company in a long time. But commercial banks, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Chase, they're a general purpose lender. You can get a loan to buy a business. You can get all kinds of loans from them, right? They'll even make a construction loan, which is a short-term loan to build, right? They'll do all sorts of different things. The Federal Reserve Board. Now, the Federal Reserve Board affects federally in California chartered banks. And they can change the flow of money by messing with the cash reserves, adjusting the discount rate, or buying and selling government bonds. A few minutes ago, there was a statement about bonds, which I said I was going to, get to. I'm getting to it. The cash reserves, they lower the reserves, it increases the supply of money, and increasing the reserves, it decreases the supply of money. All right. And the discount rate is the rate that the banks charge each other, that the Fed would charge the bank. And selling bonds tightens the money supply. They don't do anything with FHA. All right, let's look at my high production diagram. We're going to start over here on the left. So we have a bank, and in the basement, there's a vault. Now, banks are required to keep a certain percentage of their assets in reserve in the vault. So if somebody comes in and says, I want $100,000 of my money, that they, have that money. Now, when the Fed raises the reserve requirement, it means that more money has to be kept in the vault and less money can be lent out, tightening the money supply. Now, banks sometimes don't like it when the money supply tightens. So they would call the Fed up and they're going to say, look, you've raised the reserve requirements. We don't have enough money. We need money in the vault. And by the way, this is an interesting twist. The money in the vault doesn't have to be the bank's money. The bank can borrow the money to put in the vault to meet the reserve requirements. Who would lend them the money? Well, the Fed would lend them the money. The Fed would lend them the money, but the Fed wants the money back and they charge an interest rate. And the interest rate the Fed charges the banks is called the discount rate. And when the Fed raises the discount rate, the banks raise our interest rate, tightening the money supply. Those two are the simplest of the three. The one that causes more difficulty for people taking the state exam is bonds. Is it the buying of bonds that tightens the money supply or the selling of bonds that tightens the money supply? And the answer is it's the selling of bonds because there's a limited pool of capital. And when the Fed sells bonds, then investors who have money in the pool, instead of using the money to buy real estate, use the money to buy the bonds, thereby draining the pool of capital, tightening the supply of money, raising interest rates. Does the Fed make a profit doing this? And the answer is no, they don't really care about that. Why don't they care about that? And that's because, well, they can kind of print money. And if you could print money when you wanted to, would you be that worried about whether or not you're making a profit today? Probably not. Because if you didn't do well today, you'd just, fire up the presses. I had some people that had gone through my class and they went on a tour in San Francisco of the Federal Reserve Bank. For some reason, if I were in San Francisco, the Federal Reserve Bank isn't on but anyhow, whatever, they wanted to see it. And they came back and they complained because they had gotten the idea from my diagram that the United States Bureau of Engraving and Printing actually were running their printing presses in the basement of the Federal Reserve Bank, and they were disappointed to find out that was not true. So I had to explain to them what a metaphor is, right? So anyhow, I'm just saying. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, insures deposits in banks and savings and loans. A mutual savings bank, a really common question, is in the Northeast. And so Connecticut, Vermont, there's banks there, but there's not a lot of real estate, right? It's not a hot real estate market. They're very, very small. The city of LA is bigger than Vermont and bigger than Connecticut, bigger than both of them put together. So there's a way more business in California. So those banks send their money to California, and they send their money through what's called a mortgage loan correspondent. And a mortgage loan correspondent is somebody who arranges loans from banks and from life insurance companies and others. And you can either be licensed by the DRE. It's not called the Department of Corporations anymore. It's called the Department of Financial Innovation and Protection. That hasn't been on the state exam. It's a recent change in name. But anyhow, then there's mortgage companies. There's a difference between a banker and a broker. Bankers actually have money. They have vaults, stuff like that. Brokers don't have any money. They just, know people that have money. So what the mortgage broker does is the mortgage broker is an intermediary. They find a borrower, they know the lender, right? So the definition of a mortgage broker is somebody who doesn't have any money, but they know people that do have money and they can arrange a loan. The mortgage brokers are minimum supervision. They're organized under state law. You need a license from the Department of Real Estate. They like to sell their loans. They charge a fee for servicing the loan. Remember, servicing is collecting bills, 1/2 to 1%. And the commission is usually 1 to 2%. Remember the small loan law where they were limiting commissions to 15% and 10% and 5%? I don't know, but typically it's 1 to 2% is what the commission would be. They'll make construction loans, and the phrase warehousing is when the mortgage company collects loans that they intend to sell in the future. Pension funds, these are like, large pension funds, colleges. Private lenders are a large source of junior loans. Other people will make them. Syndicates, I talk about in another class. Credit unions, I like credit unions. They're nonprofit. I work with Golden One and some other credit unions. They only lend to members, but anybody can be a member. And the Federal Land Bank this has been a question on the exam. They originate and services loans on farms and large tracts of land. That's essentially what the question is. What's the name of the system that originates and services loans on farms and large tracts? It's called the Federal Land Bank. The secondary mortgage market, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I actually have on my YouTube channel some videos of me hosting a spokesperson from Freddie Mac, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac operate kind of, similarly. And so what you'll hear a term called a conforming loan. And, people have said, what does that mean? Conforming to what? And Fannie Mae, which is the Federal National Mortgage Administration, and Freddie Mac, which is the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Company, what they do is they set up guidelines. And they basically say, if you've got 2 years of tax returns and a credit score above this and a debt to income ratio of that, we'll buy the loan. So when banks or mortgage companies make loans, right, and they start lending money, and then they don't have much money in the bank anymore. They don't have money in the vault, but they have all this paper. Remember, we talked about real estate paper. So all this paper is in the vault, but not very much money. So what the bank does is they sell the loans to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I could have replaced Fannie Mae with Freddie Mac and it would be operating the same. So that's where the money comes from. Right, it's the cycle of money. They get money from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They lend the money, then they sell loans to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, all the while charging fees for servicing the loan and charging commissions and things like that. And then that's Fannie Mae. And this is called a government-sponsored enterprise or entity. It's kind of a government agency, but you could buy stock in it, right? Ginnie Mae is one of their sisters, and they make loans that are for lower income families, and it's through the Department of Housing and Urban Development. There's a Sallie Mae, which has to do with student loans, but that's never been on the state exam. And then Freddie Mac is just like Fannie Mae in the sense that they also buy loans. And the reason I have speakers from Freddie Mac is because when Freddie Mac says this is what we're doing, that affects the loans lenders make, because most lenders make conforming loans conforming to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. All right, what else? The last thing I've done is I've given you a copy. This is a form that is hardwired into most of our documents in the real estate business: purchase contracts, listing agreements, lease agreements. And this is a fairly updated fair housing and discrimination advisory, and it wouldn't hurt to read this. Right? And it gives you a list of who has to comply and realtor organizations and examples of conduct. And anyhow, this is for those of you who have insomnia at night. All right. What we're going to do quickly is go through, there's a handout about how to get started. For those of you that this may be your first class, or you just aren't sure how to get started, we're going to cover that. In order to get a real estate license in California, you have to do three things. One is you have to complete 3 college level courses in real estate. You don't have to go to college. All of that's included in our program. You have to pass the state exam, and then you can apply for a license. The 3 college courses include real estate principles, real estate practice, and an elective. The elective can come from anything on this list. We use the legal aspects of real estate law, because it's the one the Department of Real Estate is going to ask you the most questions about. The college level courses that we use are from an approved supplier, approved by the California Department of Real Estate to issue the certificates of completion. You need 135 hours of pre-license training, 3 45-hour courses. The course system that we use, all of the material and the testing is online, including the final exams. The final exams are online final exams. You can take them at home, and they're open book tests, which means you can cheat as much as you want to. You get 3 hours to get 75 questions right. It's an open book test. They make you, they being the Department of Real Estate, make you wait 18 days before you can take the final exam, because you could pass tonight, because it's an open book test, and in 3 hours you could look up 75 answers. This is the easy part of getting a real estate license. This is the easy part. Online, open book, cheat as much as you want to, college courses. The hard part is passing the real estate exam. It's not an online open book test. You have to go to one of the Department of Real Estate testing facilities, and they're in Oakland and Sacramento and Fresno and Orange County and San Diego. The hour is the exam is 3 hours long with 150 multiple choice questions. You need to get 70% of the questions right in order to pass, which, if you think about it, is not a particularly high score to require. I mean, if you were, laying on the operating table and your brain surgeon came in and told you that they had gotten their brain surgeon's license by getting 70% of the questions right on the brain surgeon's exam, that would not sound very good, because they missed 30% of all the questions they were asked about brain surgery. So you don't have to be a brain surgeon to get a real estate license. All you have to do is get 70% and you're in. However, every time the Department of Real Estate gives this exam, they fail over half the people in the room. Many of them they have failed before. And you can take the test an unlimited number of times. What I do is I prepare people for passing the real estate exam. I have 12 of these classes, 6:30 to 8:45, Wednesday nights, broadcast on the internet and recorded. They're like a pizza, warm and cheesy, and they're a pizza in that there is no first slice. You can start with any one. They're taught as independent modules. It just keeps going around and around in the cycle. The investment in the whole program is $398. It includes the live classes, the video replays, the course outline, practice testing, everything, including college level courses and a Saturday cram class. I have really good reviews. I've been doing this for a long time. Virtually everyone who goes through the course passes the exam on their first try. I have a placement program and a rebate program. As I said, I have a team of agents throughout the state of California. When you've passed, let's talk. How long does it take to get through the college courses? Requires 54 days, 18 days for principles, 18 days for practice, 18 days for legal aspects. Then, when you've completed the 3 college courses, you can apply to take the state exam. It's going to take 4 to 6 weeks. While you're waiting, you would start the fingerprint processing part, which takes 6 weeks. Once you pass the test, it's going to take a couple of weeks to get your license. let's just say 4 to 6 months is what you're going to need. What does it cost? The college level license prep is $398. The exam and to get a license is $305. Fingerprinting and processing is $75. $778 is what it's going to cost you to get in the door. Other fees, I mentioned the MLS and the Association of Realtors, those are annual numbers. And I just would like to reiterate that our average commission is more than 20,000. I didn't say that. Once you get your license, it's good for 4 years. Every 4 years, you have to renew it, pay a $245 fee and take some continuing education. If you wanted to get started, you'd go to my website, dreclass.com, pick on the sign up now button. If you're just beginning and you need the whole program, you would choose the first option for $398. If you're about to take the state exam, I have a Saturday workshop, which is only $99. It includes the Saturday plus some testing. The middle option is for people that have taken the college level courses some time ago. They're good forever, but they really don't remember, they need the whole program in order to pass. If you've got questions, reach out to us. You can email, you can call, you can set up an appointment to talk to me. That calendar link works. All right, that's all I've got. Thank you very much for coming.